This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our Military History Nights 2018 season opened on January the 10th with a talk by Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Charles Godfrey on the role of the Army of India in World War I. Dr. Godfrey.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'm delighted to be here tonight. And I must say, a personal note, Jim McGillivray back there, an old classmate of mine, came all the way down from Copaconk or wherever it is to see me. I'm delighted to see him, and a number of other old friends have sort of come out of the woodwork. I'm delighted to hear you're still around. I also want to, before I forget, acknowledge my thanks to Tom Klein here, who's my major contributor, making sure the slides are correct and making sure they're in time. He's a great fellow. On August the 6th, 1914, Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, requested the Imperial Parliament for the mobilization of the Indian Army. Prime Minister Asquith was not enthused, as he was concerned they might one day want their freedom. This is a white man's war. On September the 30th, that is 24 days later, 2 Indian infantry divisions and 2 cavalry brigades landed in Marseille en route to the Ypres salient Battle of La Bassée. India had the only large-scale, fully trained volunteer army of 256,000 in the world. Kitchener knew the effective readiness for the British Army was only about 80,000 troops. There were territorial divisions, which he considered untrained and useless, and he was in favor of a regular army to train a new army, which would be the size of the French and German armies. He foresaw this would be needed to fight a war lasting many years, and in the interim, the contemptible little army would fight and the treaty with France would be maintained. There are multiple reasons on why a soldier and how a soldier, conscripted or volunteer, functions. Nowhere is there a persuading belief, nil an axiom, theory, never a convincing formula to explain the soldier's action facing victory, disease, disgrace, or death. From its earliest history, the Indian warrior had been the key person to peace in the vast country with many different religions, trading habits, determinations to live by their personal beliefs, and fealty to the leader. Great areas such as chiefdoms were protected by a type of army, usually small bands gathered together, who would work on foot, horse, or elephant in order to get the weakest part of the invading army. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, swept into India from the north, decimating all opposition with a strong cavalry brigade, attacking first frontally and then swerving around the flank and charging to the rear. This tactic was the result of training and lasted for more than 2 centuries. However, his descendants were not particularly concerned with maintaining any military stature. With the expansion of agriculture and the growth of business activities, a need for an organized group of protecting warriors resulted, although there was no special program of training. This changed as a result of activities in Europe. Following the defeat of the Spanish Armada, merchants in England formed an East India Company to profit on trade in the Middle East. It took a while for the company to become established, but there was an urgency, as the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese had similar ideas. There was constant fighting between them, in spite of the fact of the peace treaties that were going on in Europe itself. It was necessary for the company, East India Company, to protect their warehouses. The company made a deal with the government of England to have a regiment of Indians trained by the British Army and establish discipline in groups of sepoys. These battalions of natives were in effect a British Army and carried out continuing warfare with the French and the others until finally Robert Clive at Plassey drove the French out of India. To establish a firm foundation for the protection of the companies, Clive proceeded to anglicize these battalions by contrast, which ensured payments, care of the wounded, possibility of promotion, and benefits to widows. This was an entirely new approach. Each volunteer had to swear before his oath, before his priest, and pledge loyalty to his commander. Pledge loyalty to his commander. He was provided with a red tunic, which showed that he was part of a military organization. He had further uniforms, and it was necessary they be identified as a formal army. And this was the beginning of the Indian Army. This was a novel approach by the companies, but it provided insurance of future employment and also many of the benefits promised by Clive. In addition, there was a new relationship between the British officers and the men due to a sincere feeling from the older British officers who were enthusiastic about building a new British Army. There was personal interest on the part of many in the welfare of the soldiers and their families. Some of this was based on the real possibility that the sons of warriors would enlist when they came of age, providing a further source of warriors. This frequently resulted in more than a loyal following of the commander, particularly after military encounters such as the Sikh War, which showed the skill of the chief. The commander became a hero to be idealized. What I'm doing is showing here the number and variety of costumes, tunics, etc., which was adapted by this growing Indian Army, which had never been there before. These are a final group of assistants to the Viceroy, and you can see they have taken on all the appearances of the British Army. In essence, this was an English army taking over India without a conquest. The flag was following trade, and India was becoming an opportunity for second and third British sons to achieve fortune and possibly fame in business or the army. Officers in the British units received their commission at Sandhurst and an increase in pay before posting. Indian officers qualified in their battalion and had limited standing with the Brits. In time, with the presence of more families from back home, proper lawns and gardens soon appeared, and life, although hot, was tempered by the unlimited service personnel. The welcome appearance of an Anglican church provided some reassurance to families who had difficulty in a heathen community. The differences in sanitation, the frequency of non-Christian festivals, and isolation into British communities compounded an inacceptance of the niggers. Not infrequently, the imperial officers took employment elsewhere. After all, this was the land of the pagoda tree, and you shook it for money. A gradual change occurred in the relationship between officers and sepoys. The original camaraderie with the men in the ranks decreased, particularly with the presence of new officers who had no experience or understanding of their charges. They did have an undercurrent of imperial racism. Not infrequently, a new Brit officer, out of uniform, open-shirted, drinking a beer, accepted a report from a full-dressed Indian officer in a casual, contemptuous manner. There was no ability or desire to appreciate the qualities of the blacks. In addition, the East India Company made several mistakes. The number of British officers was increased and put directly in charge of the sepoys, replacing many of the roles of the native officers. There were several misunderstandings about bata, which was the reward drawn from the loot of a defeated enemy. In spite of the promises by senior officers that this matter would be rectified, the company failed, and in some cases the generals themselves made up the deficiency from their own pocket. This caused a widespread growing unrest among the sepoys, which caused a major confrontation in 1857, when Bengal companies refused to use the provided grease for cartridges in their new Lee Enfield rifles. A wildfire rumor spread through the ranks that pig or cow fat had been used to grease the cartridges. Officers explained to the parade that it wasn't necessary to bite the cartridge, as they had done before, but distrust imploded that this was a lie. A mutiny broke out with the execution of the officers, and a wildfire turned into a forced inferno which spread to all of the English settlements with massacres of men, women, and children. The majority of the rebels were Muslims, but a large proportion of non-revolters sided with the rescuing British Army, which brought peace, punished the revolters, and began the task of rebuilding. The 1857 Sepoy Mutiny, or as it was termed, the First War of Independence, cost thousands of British lives, hundreds of thousands of dead Indians, and there was one further death. The East India Company was discharged, and the Crown took over the rule of British India. This required numerous meetings in London and India to decide where military was required for the country. It was decided there should be one army based in England, and the personnel should be enrolled to fight anywhere in the world. The Viceroy of India commissioned native officers who had command over the sepoys, but they were beneath any Brit officer. The Indian Army was a collective term for armies of the three presidencies, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, which was concerned with internal security, plus a major assignment along the northwest frontier, where Russia continued to play the great game. And this was a mountainous, ruggedly difficult, inhospitable land, 400 miles long and 100 miles wide, which contained many independent tribes and required constant surveillance. However, there had been a marked reduction of military problems in the remainder of the country, but an increase in activities in other countries to maintain Britain's interests. In August of 1900, a contingent of Indian troops went to Peking to control the Boxer Revolution. In 1903, a contingent of Sikhs went to Somaliland to control the Mad Mullah. Francis Young Husband led two defenses in 1904 and 1907 when there was a renewed outbreak of terrorists in the Northwest. These expeditions were handled briskly as the Army developed skill in organization and transportation. This was part of an upgrading of training led by Lord Kitchener and Douglas Haig. Each pressed to increase the size of the Indian Army, but were prevented by Viceroy Harding, who was anxious to spend any funds on social development. However, Haig, who was then Chief of Indian General Staff, feared India could start a war to supersede the British Empire in alliance with Turkey. He, in cooperation with the General Staff, planned a secret, massive expansion. Harding, the Vice Consul, heard of the problem and ordered Haig to stop it right away. Haig passed these orders to the planners, adding there would be a minimal penalty if disobeyed. The arrival of thousands of troops in Marseille was a major event for the citizens who flocked to see and cheer for Les Annes. Sword-carrying troops, 100 busloads of warriors wearing strange headgear caused applause. The troops occupied the racecourse and other areas with thousands of tents, kitchens for different foods, for different religions, and places of worship had to be arranged. August in France became cold, and the Indian Corps had light cotton uniforms, did not have any heavy uniforms coming from India. And they began to suffer from cold, which resulted in a massive appeal to French and British for woolen clothing. A large amount of woolen clothing appeared, which is used at times in a very strange manner. However, the fall and winter following were brutally cold, and it was not until next spring that heavier uniforms could be obtained from England. Visiting Prince Generals visited the king. The wild enthusiasm throughout the whole of the country continued, the whole of India continued. At the initial announcement that they would be going to war with Germany, many of the soldiers had ever heard of Germany, never mind knowing what Germany was. However, the enthusiasm continued. But voice was concerned by some citizens about the relationships of the British and French women and these romantic-looking warriors. They wear black, you know. The Indian troops came from a wide variety of sources, mainly from the northern part of India and Nepal. Mainly from around the north part here. They were used to heavy lifting. They were used to managing for themselves. Down here, they were more business. Some were the army of the princes who enthusiastically supported the campaign. In the early days, they learned a different style of fighting when they came to France and were introduced to gas warfare during the initial release of gas in France. The regiments continued working, and the enthusiasm continued from India, even after they'd been in war for a number of months and had noted the casualties that were being seen. They had several problems. A number of their injured were removed from the site and replaced by soldiers from other regiments. Now, these were not regiments who had had any experience, and where they ended up with the result there was a good deal of trouble with working together. Many men received decorations and several of the Victoria Cross, sometimes posthumously. The Royal Flying Corps had India's first ace after he had shot down 12 ships. Others in the Air Force received decorations. We may see some pictures of them later on. The Sikh headdress always evoked curiosity, particularly during a mixed meeting of various units, and the king obliged. I think we'll just catch up to the king, eh? This is the hero who died after he shot down 12 and had been decorated with a DFC and other. And this is an area where the Indians were able to penetrate against the resistance that had been given before. The king wore this type of head covering because, as he pointed out, the tin hats had not already appeared. By the end of 1914, after battles of Mons, Le Cateau, La Baisse, the Aisne, and the Ypres, the old British regular army was almost wiped out. It had retreated 400 kilometers in 17 days, ending at the Battle of the Marne, and the Kaiser was predicting once again the end of this contemptible little army. Part of this little army were 2 regiments with their drivers, cooking pots, and other supplies. They too had sustained many casualties before coming to this particular area. They were joined by other Indian regiments to protect an area of 8 miles alongside the British Army and on the left side of the French Army. This whole Indian portion came under Haig's command in New Year 1915. Field Marshal John French, who prevented a breakthrough by the Germans in his retreat, was under constant pressure from Marshal Foch and the Russians to act more aggressively, possibly a breakthrough of the German lines. French gave this assignment to Haig, and he and his staff made great plans for increasing their numbers from the recruited new army to break through a German salient at Neuve-Chapelle. With the aim, according to Haig, to proceed after they'd broken through up to Lille, which was a German distribution area through the rail. This would cripple the German transportation system. Haig and his staff prepared a detailed plan for the enterprise, including many raids to determine geography, opposing regiments, and estimation of possible resistance. The basis for the attack was a massive bombardment of the trenches, and the town was to paralyze the enemy. Aerial photography, intelligence reports, prisoner questioning gave greater depth to the enterprise. 4 Indian brigades were stationed to make the major attack, with 2 British brigades on their side. A 2nd Brigade of Indian Corps was to advance after the initial stage, moving from back here forward. The attack beginning March the 12th was successful after the severe bombardment. Next slide, that please. This is where the Indians were taking off from here, marching up to there, pushing up to there, with the aim of taking the city here, the town here, and then proceeding on to Aubers Ridge and Lille. This is where the British regiments were to protect the flank of the Indians. Now this is the first time the Indian Army had ever been given a specific program and put in charge of it, under Haig's direction, of course. The Indian Corps was very successful, and they found that they were able to get into New Chapelle with a good deal of house-to-house finding, and were ready to move on. They contacted headquarters, but were told they were to stay where they were. At that time, there was little or no resistance left the other side of Neuchâtel up here. It had all been wiped out. Headquarters for Haig was 5 miles behind the front. Telephone lines was a major communication, and the telephone lines did not last because the Germans had a fair bombardment in return, and all of the wires were blown up. Runners were used, but they were on open, rough ground and were usually shot and didn't manage at all. Any other means of communication was lost. However, we continue to see major advances by the Indian Corps. When the Corps occupied the town, the Germans had disappeared, and the 25th Brigade, which on the left, next slide please, was aided by the Indian machine gunners. Next slide please. And specific marches and attacks by the Indian Corps against the Germans. And this shows the attack. He's holding a bomb which was manufactured by the Indian Army. He was the lieutenant who devised it. And they didn't have Mills bombs or anything like that in those days. What they did was they filled jam pots up with explosives and would light those with a match. These ones up here had a little bit of flint in them, and that could be used to set off the fuse and get them going. As I said, the British Army on the left was supposed to protect the flank of the Indian Corps. Unfortunately, the proposed bombardment to clear the field for the Indian troops never took place because no shells were left. There was a shortage of shells, and this had not been considered by Haig when doing the initial planning. With the result, the Indians could not advance any further, and the British troops suffered a lot of casualties when Haig ordered them to advance even though the bombardment had not been carried out. On page 10, by March the 12th, the Germans had fortified their lines and further advances were not possible. The fight had been a limited success with staggering casualties on either side, and Jesus wept. There were no further major attacks on either side. The Indian Corps continued to hold its line until November 1915. This whole line here, which more than 8 miles, and in November 1915 they were transferred to the east for other problems. The press at home bugled. This was a great British victory, which could have been better. There's a proud statement by French about the work of the British Army with one passing comment about the Indian Corps. He did, however, point out the lack of shells was unforgivable. His comments were picked up by a personal friend, Charles Repington. It's Charles. Repington, who had been visiting with the general and had a connection with the London Times. He immediately sent the next slide, please. He immediately sent the story on to the Times. At that time, reporters were not allowed in the front. It just so happened he'd been there with his friend, the general. He was not supposed to transmit that information, particularly the thought that there had been a gross shortage of shells. This, of course, continued to be a major problem and eventually ended in a large inquiry, with the result the Prime Minister had to resolve because of the shell scandal. But the scandal meant full consideration of several items was squashed. For example, Haig was a cavalry officer, as most of the senior officers in the British Army at that time were. They were all cavalry, had come up through the Boer War where the cavalry had been so important. And he himself had distinguished himself with a spectacular charge during the Boer War. But he did not take advantage of using the cavalry to break through where the Indian Corps had created a great hole, and there was no particular resistance at that time. In addition, there were questions as to why he was not aware of the lack of shells for the second bombardment, with the resultant vulnerability of the Indian Corps. Some comments were made recalling that he failed the mathematics course at the Officers Training Center in Camberley, and he just wasn't capable of figuring out how many shells would be needed. He also ignored the failure to reach his goal of Auber's Ridge, which had been one of the original goals of the program. Instead, in his publication, he stated the operation at Neuve-Chapelle was a total success. Over 1,200 wounded 12,000 wounded Indian soldiers were seen at special hospitals in England. Originally, they were in the General Military Hospital, but dietary necessities and other conditions demanded they should be seen in special areas. The second most important was taking over the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. These were unoccupied and provided sufficient crowded facilities. In addition, there were sufficient grounds and exercise could be given. It was necessary to provide separate kitchens and procedures for preparation of food. Deaths required a special procedure. Originally, female nurses were present, but they were suspected of being with males and were withdrawn altogether. It was noted there were a large number of wounds of the left hand, with the suggestion that these were self-inflicted wounds. These wounds were seen in a general resting area. As you can see, the beds are all in the main chamber where they hold concerts now. But a large number of soldiers were seen with bandages on their left hand, and the rumor went around that these were self-inflicted wounds. However, a program of investigation showed that the wounds on the left hand were the way in which they held the rifle. That is, up forward like this, and this was hit by the incoming shell, whereas this hand here was close to the body. If the bullet went there, they didn't survive. So that rumor showed there was no problem of that. But there was a problem with desertion. A small number of Indians felt that they didn't know what the war was all about. They were unhappy with being made to go back into the trenches after they'd been wounded, because that wasn't a custom they'd had previously. So they deserted with the idea they would take their rifles, go over to the German side. The Germans would then let them go home. Of course, it didn't work that way. The Germans took the rifles, put them in a POW camp, and became very interested in doing a study on these Indians whom they'd never seen before, and they set a number of their teachers to write histories of them and recorded a large number on early gramophones in order to preserve their voices and their stories. Churchill won the argument in January 1915 when it was decided to relieve pressure on Russia by invading the Caucasus. His plan was to defeat the Turks at Gallipoli by a massive bombardment from the Royal Navy capital ships, then proceed through the Channel up to the Black Sea. His plan was that this campaign would be conducted largely by New Zealand, Australian, and Indian troops. The first bombardment was not effective. It was necessary to move closer and repeat. Unfortunately, the minesweepers were inefficient, and in one day, 3 capital ships were sunk and 3 crippled, resulting in the fleet moving outside. In spite of the difficulty in landing on poor beaches, leading to accession up the cliffs in the face of Ottoman fire, there were thousands and thousands of casualties, with a large number due to disease and dysentery, because these troops were all crowded together on the beach with only minimal types of facilities. By May the 20th, 6,000 had died. In August, an attempt was made by the Sikh, Gurkha, and Patio regiments, which was successful, and climbed up the beach to reach the crest, then receive friendly fire from the fleet and had to return. Many of them died, following the injunction which many of the soldiers received from their family: die in battle, do not despair. Their accommodation, of course, was primitive. They were simply living on the side of a cliff. However, one of the major benefits they had was working with the Aussies and the New Zealanders, and they got along very well with them. In addition to that, they conducted a major service to contact and remove all of the injured. As I said, their relationships with the other groups, the other soldiers, was entirely different than had been the case back in France. Their relationships were excellent. In January 1916, the army withdrew, leaving Kemal Ataturk his first victory for the Turkish army, and altogether there had been 7,000 Indian casualties, including 1,600 deaths. The only consolation was the hearty comradeship which I mentioned before. Churchill, the name recurs over and over again, had persuaded the English Parliament to purchase oil interests in the Persian Gulf because he was convinced that the British fleet would be converting to oil. To protect this interest, it was directed that British and Indian troops should proceed to the Persian Gulf in November of 1914 to protect Abadan and other areas against the Turks. In addition, the army was to advance up the Tigris to Baghdad. They won a victory north of Kut at Alamara, but because Townsend, Major General Townsend, had not provided for sufficient support, he had to retire to Kut, where he was held for 9 months and besieged, with no ability for anybody to go in or out. This resulted in terrible deaths and the emaciation of thousands of troops who, many of them died, if not there. They did die after the surrender was made, and these Indian troops were then put in a POW camp. It's been described as one of the most disgraceful episodes of British India. Unfortunately, it occurred just at the same time when the Brits had to leave Gallipoli, and the publicity and the thoughts going that the British were on a downward swing was quite common. It was wise that saving the British Empire by the Army of India is more than a magnificent fighting, because another campaign was necessary to secure more of the East by sending armies into Haifa and assisting in the conquest from the Ottoman Empire of the Jewish cities alongside the coast. It's wise to appreciate that saving the British Empire by the Army of India is more than the magnificent fighting in France. Britain depended on the Empire for raw material, especially oil, which justifies the loss of Indian soldiers protecting these areas. But it's also necessary to appreciate the whole of the war saw the Indian soldier as second class, particularly when considered by headquarters and senior British Army staff. It took many gallant episodes and thousands of deaths before there was a reckoning that these blacks were white underneath. Kipling wrote of Gunga Din, "You're a better man than I am." This credo had to be accepted by the English, the French, and the Germans. Every year, there is a new discovery of fallen Indian warriors who have been forgotten. For example, at Dunkirk. If any of you saw the film Dunkirk, there's no mention of Indian corps there. They're not in the movie. 2 skeletons found in France have been reburied, and their collar tabs attest to their presence. There were many Victoria Crosses awarded to sepoys at one time or another. We in Canada are of a different ilk, and after considerable pressure, recognize that our indigent population merited equality. These are some of our indigent population, and this is recordings of their placement in the Canadian forces and the examples of the good service that was carried on. There's a vivid coupling of British and Indian heritage. Rabindranath Tagore wrote a poem. Wilfred Owen, killed the poet of Dulce Tagore Mess, killed in the last week of the war, wrote to his mother, who received the letter after his death. He quoted the poem by Tagore, When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I've seen is unsurpassable. I've tasted of the hidden honey of this locust that expands on the ocean of light, and thus am I blessed. Let this be my parting word. In this playhouse of infinite forms, I've had my play, and here have I caught sight of him that is formless. My whole body and my limbs have thrilled with his touch, which is beyond touch. And if the end comes here, let it come. Let this be my parting word. Many Indians made the same parting words. Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thanks for joining us.